The moment John Kennedy leaned forward and asked Nancy Pelosi how a public servant on a government salary could emerge as one of the wealthiest figures in Congress, the room did not erupt in outrage or applause. It did something far more revealing. It went still, because everyone present understood that a line had just been crossed. Some of you watching right now are probably asking why that opening mattered so much, why one question carried more weight than hours of testimony, and why it felt less like curiosity and more like accusation. Here is the answer, and I want this stated clearly before anything else unfolds. Stay with this video until the very end, because the reason for that opening strike explains every document, every silence, and every shift in power that followed. What happened next was not improvised, not emotional, and not accidental. It was the collision of two political realities that could no longer exist in the same space. Once that collision occurred, there was no way to pretend this was just another hearing. Nancy Pelosi entered the room with the confidence of someone who had survived nearly 4 decades at the highest levels of American power. A confidence built not on arrogance, but on repetition, experience, and institutional protection. She had been questioned before, criticized before, even vilified before. Yet every storm had passed without altering her position, her authority, or her place in the political hierarchy. Over time, that survival became a form of insulation, creating an assumption that scrutiny itself had limits, boundaries that would not be crossed in polite company. This assumption shaped her posture, her tone, and her expectations as she took her seat, because nothing in her experience suggested that this day would be different. John Kennedy arrived with a fundamentally different understanding of the moment. He did not see the hearing as an exercise in performance or a platform for partisan messaging, but as an opportunity to test whether those unspoken boundaries still held. His preparation was not designed to produce viral outrage, because outrage is fleeting and easily dismissed, but to apply sustained pressure through sequence, timing, and accumulation. Power rarely collapses under a single blow, but it weakens when forced to explain itself repeatedly under conditions it does not control. That was the strategy, and it depended entirely on the opening question doing its job. By reducing a complex web of disclosures, investments, and political privilege into a single, comprehensible inquiry, Kennedy removed the protective fog that usually surrounds such discussions. He did not accuse Pelosi of a crime, because crimes invite legal defenses, but he challenged the legitimacy of an outcome, which invites moral judgment. That distinction mattered because legitimacy cannot be defended with technicalities alone. Once the audience understands the question, control over the narrative begins to slip. Pelosi's initial response reflected decades of instinctive calibration, the practiced ability to project calm while internally assessing whether familiar defenses would still function. Her experience had taught her that allegations could be reframed as partisan attacks, and that partisan attacks often lose credibility once they are contextualized. What she encountered instead was not an allegation, but a pattern presented without haste, without theatrics, and without apology. Patterns linger in a way accusations do not, because they invite comparison rather than rebuttal. As the exchange unfolded, it became clear that the discomfort in the room was not limited to Pelosi herself, but extended to those who recognized the broader implications of the line of questioning. Washington is filled with people who benefit from complexity, because complexity allows uncomfortable realities to be deferred indefinitely. By collapsing that complexity into chronology and consequence, Kennedy made deferral impossible. Every reference to timing, every juxtaposition of decision and outcome forced the audience to confront the possibility that what had long been normalized might not be defensible. This was not about ideology, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. Ideological conflict allows participants to retreat into familiar camps, but structural critique destabilizes everyone who depends on the structure. Pelosi's authority had been built during an era when institutional trust could absorb contradiction without consequence, when the public largely accepted that governance was opaque by necessity. That era has been eroding for years, driven by economic strain, information saturation, and a growing perception that political outcomes favor a narrow class insulated from risk. Kennedy's approach did not create that perception, it simply gave it a focal point. The audience, both inside the room and watching remotely, sensed this shift immediately, even if they could not yet articulate it. This sensing is what transforms a routine hearing into a moment of reckoning, because it signals that something previously intangible has become visible. Pelosi's challenge was no longer to defend individual decisions, but to reassert the credibility of a system that increasingly felt detached from the lives of ordinary citizens. That is an extraordinarily difficult task in a setting designed to compress complex realities into brief exchanges. Every attempt to broaden the conversation risked appearing evasive, while every attempt to narrow it reinforced the underlying critique. This paradox is the hidden vulnerability of entrenched power, because its greatest strength, continuity, becomes its greatest weakness under sustained scrutiny. As the hearing progressed, the contrast between ritual and reality grew sharper, with Pelosi relying on the language of governance and Kennedy relying on the logic of sequence. One spoke in abstractions shaped by decades of leadership. The other spoke in terms that required no translation for the audience to grasp. That imbalance mattered because it shifted the emotional center of gravity away from authority and toward accountability. What was unfolding was not a takedown, but an exposure, a gradual unveiling of assumptions that had gone unchallenged for too long. The hearing room became a microcosm of a broader national tension, one that has been building quietly beneath partisan conflict and media spectacle. This tension is not about left versus right, but about distance. The distance between those who make decisions and those who live with the consequences. Kennedy's questions forced that distance into the open, and Pelosi was asked, implicitly and repeatedly, to justify it. By the time the first hour passed, it was already clear that the usual choreography would not hold. The exchange had moved beyond performance into something more dangerous for those accustomed to control, which is sustained attention. Once sustained attention attaches itself to power, outcomes become unpredictable. The opening question had done exactly what it was designed to do. It shifted the frame, altered expectations, and removed the comfort of inevitability. What followed would escalate this confrontation dramatically, but the foundation had already been laid. Because once legitimacy is questioned publicly, it does not return easily, and every subsequent moment either repairs the breach or widens it. On that Tuesday morning, the breach was already visible. Everything that came next would flow from that fact. What changed the dynamic in the room was not volume or aggression, but repetition. Because Kennedy understood that power resists confrontation, but weakens under sustained methodical pressure that refuses to move on. Instead of escalating emotionally, he returned again and again to sequence, to timing, to what happened first and what followed afterward, forcing the conversation to remain anchored in chronology rather than rhetoric. Chronology is dangerous in Washington because it strips intent of its camouflage and reveals patterns that cannot be dismissed as coincidence without asking the audience to abandon basic logic. Each return to the timeline tightened the frame, reducing the available space for abstraction and increasing the cost of evasion. This was not interrogation in the dramatic sense. It was compression, and compression is how narratives break. Pelosi's responses reflected a lifetime of institutional fluency, invoking complexity, long-term policy goals, and the collective nature of congressional decision-making. Those answers would have sufficed in a different era, one where audiences trusted that complexity itself was evidence of legitimacy. But complexity without clarity now reads less like wisdom and more like insulation, especially to viewers already skeptical of concentrated political privilege. Kennedy did not challenge her intelligence or experience because doing so would have shifted the exchange into personality conflict. Instead, he allowed her expertise to stand, while quietly asking whether that expertise had produced outcomes ordinary citizens could recognize as fair. The discomfort grew not because Pelosi appeared unprepared, but because preparation itself seemed insufficient against the structure of the questions being asked. Preparation assumes predictable lines of attack, familiar frames, and shared norms about what is considered off-limits. Kennedy's approach ignored those norms entirely, not by violating decorum, but by declining to acknowledge the boundaries it relies on. That refusal unsettled more than hostility ever could, because it suggested the old rules were no longer binding. When rules lose their authority, experience becomes less valuable than adaptability. Members of the room who were not directly involved began to sense the shift as well, because institutional instinct recognizes disruption before it becomes visible. Staffers adjusted their posture, aides stopped whispering, and even the rhythm of note-taking changed, subtle signs that something was unfolding outside the script. These micro-reactions matter, because power is maintained as much by collective expectation as by formal authority. When expectation falters, even briefly, authority has to work harder to sustain itself. Pelosi's calm remained intact, but calm alone cannot restore a frame once it has been destabilized. Kennedy's persistence reframed the exchange from a dispute about justification into a test of credibility. Credibility operates differently than authority, because it must be granted rather than assumed. Authority can command attention, but credibility must earn it continuously. By keeping the questions accessible, Kennedy invited the audience into the evaluation process, effectively decentralizing judgment. Once judgment is decentralized, control over interpretation weakens significantly. Pelosi attempted to re-centralize that control by emphasizing her long record of public service and legislative accomplishment. Those achievements are real and substantial, but they address a different question than the one being asked. The issue was no longer whether she had served, but whether the system she navigated produced outcomes that could withstand public scrutiny. Service explains effort, but it does not automatically justify reward. That gap between effort and reward is where public trust erodes. As the exchange continued, it became clear that Kennedy was not pursuing a singular revelation, but building cumulative weight. Each answer that deferred clarity added to that weight, not because it was false, but because it failed to resolve the underlying tension. Viewers do not require absolute proof to sense imbalance. They require coherence, and coherence was slipping. This slippage did not indict Pelosi alone, but the broader ecosystem that had normalized such disparities without sustained examination. Kennedy's role was less prosecutor than catalyst, accelerating a process already underway. The hearing thus transformed from a procedural event into a referendum on distance, the distance between governance and lived reality. Pelosi represented continuity, stability, and institutional memory, while Kennedy represented interruption, disruption, and recalibration. Neither role is inherently virtuous or destructive, but their collision exposed the limits of each. Continuity without accountability breeds resentment, while disruption without structure breeds chaos. The tension between the two defined the room. What unsettled observers most was not that Pelosi struggled, but that struggle itself was now visible. Visibility is the enemy of entrenched power, because it removes the aura of inevitability that sustains it. Once power appears contingent rather than permanent, it invites questions it previously deflected by default. Those questions do not require immediate answers to be effective. They only require persistence. Kennedy provided that persistence. By the midpoint of the exchange, it was evident that the outcome would not be measured by sound bites or immediate concessions. The real impact lay in the shift of perception, the subtle realignment of what audiences considered reasonable to ask. Once that threshold moves, it rarely moves back. Pelosi remained composed, articulate, and authoritative, but authority was no longer the sole metric in play. Credibility had entered the equation, and credibility answers to a different standard. That standard would become increasingly difficult to satisfy as the afternoon wore on. What began as a single, carefully placed question had evolved into a broader examination of power itself. And that examination was only beginning. What shifted next was not the content of the questions, but the distribution of attention. Because once the exchange escaped its procedural confines, it began to implicate people who were not being addressed directly. Cameras lingered longer, producers hesitated before cutting away, and commentators grew cautious with their phrasing. Subtle signs that the narrative had become less predictable. In institutional settings, unpredictability is not merely uncomfortable, it is dangerous, because it threatens the quiet consensus that keeps processes moving smoothly. The hearing was no longer a contained event. It was becoming a signal, and signals travel faster than arguments. This was the moment when the conversation moved beyond the room. Pelosi understood this shift instinctively, because long tenure teaches leaders to read not just words, but atmospheres, and the atmosphere had changed decisively. Her responses began to widen in scope, emphasizing shared responsibility, collective governance, and historical context, an attempt to diffuse focus rather than confront it directly. Diffusion works when the audience accepts dispersion as sophistication, but it fails when viewers are already primed to seek clarity. Kennedy recognized this immediately and responded not by narrowing his questions, but by grounding them even more firmly in specifics. Specifics resist diffusion. By introducing dates, sequences, and causal relationships, he forced the discussion back into a frame that could not easily be blurred. Each reference to timing served as an anchor, preventing the conversation from drifting into generalities where accountability dissolves. This methodical anchoring transformed the exchange into something resembling an audit rather than a debate. Audits unsettle institutions because they reduce narratives to ledgers, and ledgers are indifferent to intention. The audience sensed this shift intuitively, even if they lacked the technical details to articulate it fully. Public trust does not hinge on mastery of policy, but on the perception that outcomes align with effort and risk. When that alignment appears broken, explanations feel inadequate regardless of their accuracy. Pelosi's long record of service, once her greatest asset, now complicated her position by amplifying the contrast between continuity and consequence. Longevity invites respect, but it also invites scrutiny, because time accumulates both achievement and contradiction. Kennedy's approach leveraged that accumulation without explicitly naming it. He allowed the weight of years to speak for itself, framing questions in ways that invited viewers to draw their own conclusions. This was a strategic choice, because conclusions reached independently feel more durable than those imposed externally. By resisting the urge to editorialize, Kennedy increased the credibility of the inquiry itself. Pelosi, in turn, attempted to reassert narrative control by emphasizing the broader mission of public service. Mission statements resonate when institutions are trusted, but they falter when trust is strained. In moments of skepticism, audiences gravitate toward evidence rather than ethos. Kennedy supplied structure rather than accusation, and structure proved more persuasive. The exchange thus became asymmetrical, with one side appealing to legitimacy through legacy and the other appealing to legitimacy through coherence. Coherence does not require agreement, only internal consistency, and that standard is unforgiving. As the hearing continued, media framing began to shift subtly, moving away from partisan shorthand toward questions about process and precedent. This shift mattered because it signaled that the story was escaping ideological containment. Once an issue is framed as systemic rather than partisan, it becomes harder to dismiss without addressing underlying mechanics. Pelosi's experience equipped her to navigate ideological battles, but systemic critique operates on a different plane. It does not attack beliefs, it interrogates outcomes. Outcomes are stubborn because they persist regardless of intent or rhetoric. Kennedy's insistence on outcome-focused questioning exposed a vulnerability in the institutional narrative, one that could not be patched with appeals to complexity alone. The audience's reaction reflected this, with attention sustained not by outrage, but by recognition. Recognition is quieter than anger, but it is more consequential because it reshapes expectations. Once expectations shift, institutions must adapt or risk appearing obsolete. Pelosi's composure remained steady, but composure cannot substitute for resolution when legitimacy is under examination. The hearing had reached a point where answers were no longer judged solely on their content, but on their capacity to restore alignment between authority and fairness. That alignment remained elusive. What was unfolding was not a verdict, but a recalibration, a slow adjustment in how power was perceived rather than how it was exercised. Such recalibrations rarely announce themselves dramatically, but their effects accumulate over time. Kennedy's role in this process was catalytic rather than conclusive. He was not closing a case, he was opening a question that would persist beyond the room. Pelosi, by virtue of her prominence, became the focal point of that persistence. This was not a personal reckoning, but an institutional one, and institutions respond differently than individuals. They adapt slowly, resist reflexively, and concede reluctantly. The remainder of the hearing would test each of those tendencies. What had begun as a pointed inquiry was now evolving into a broader examination of how power justifies itself in an era of heightened visibility. That examination would only intensify as external pressures began to converge on the room. The next phase would reveal whether the institution could absorb this scrutiny or whether the scrutiny would reshape it. At this stage, the institution itself began to react, not through statements or votes, but through silence, which in Washington often carries more meaning than words. Staffers stopped passing notes, aides lowered their phones, and senior members adopted the still posture of people who understood that any visible movement could be interpreted as panic. Silence inside a hearing room is rarely neutral because it signals that the usual scripts are no longer sufficient to manage the moment. When process pauses, power becomes exposed, and exposure is what institutions fear most. The room was no longer governed by procedure, but by perception. Kennedy did not press harder in response to this silence, which was a calculated restraint rather than hesitation. Escalation would have restored predictability, allowing opponents to retreat into rehearsed defenses, so he instead allowed the quiet to do the work. Silence forces audiences to fill gaps themselves, and what audiences imagine is often more potent than what is spoken aloud. This technique shifted the burden subtly, moving it from the questioner to the system being questioned. Pelosi understood this maneuver immediately. Her response was not to refute a claim, but to reassert institutional continuity, invoking norms, tradition, and the idea that stability itself is a form of accountability. This is a powerful argument when the public fears chaos more than injustice. But the context had changed. Because the audience was no longer asking whether the system could endure disruption, but whether it could justify endurance without correction. Stability without credibility is interpreted as stagnation. And stagnation is politically fatal when framed as protection for insiders. As the exchange continued, it became evident that neither side was speaking solely to each other anymore. Kennedy's phrasing was calibrated for viewers who felt distant from the mechanics of governance, but intimately familiar with its consequences. Pelosi's language remained oriented toward institutional peers, signaling reassurance upward rather than outward. This divergence in audience targeting widened the gap between authority and legitimacy. Authority flows from position, but legitimacy flows from alignment with lived experience. The hearing room thus became a symbolic crossroad between those two forces. Media commentators began adjusting their tone in real time, softening absolutes and introducing qualifiers, a sign that certainty was becoming risky. When media hedges, it reflects uncertainty not about facts, but about narrative survivability. A narrative that cannot survive scrutiny must either evolve or be abandoned. Kennedy's questions were accelerating that process without naming it. Pelosi's responses attempted to slow it by contextualizing decisions within historical complexity. Complexity is often used as a shield because it implies that simple judgments are naive. However, complexity loses its protective power when outcomes remain simple and adverse. The public does not demand simplicity in explanation, but it demands clarity in consequence. When consequences appear asymmetric, explanations feel evasive regardless of their sophistication. This asymmetry was becoming increasingly difficult to obscure. What made this moment particularly destabilizing was not the presence of conflict, but the absence of spectacle. There were no raised voices, no dramatic interruptions, no overt breakdowns of decorum. Instead, there was an accumulation of unresolved tension, which is harder to deflect because it lacks a single point of release. Institutions are designed to withstand attacks, not prolonged examination. Examination exposes patterns rather than incidents. Kennedy's method emphasized patterns, connecting decisions across time without asserting motive. By avoiding accusations of intent, he denied opponents the opportunity to argue sincerity. Sincerity is subjective and unprovable, but patterns are observable. Once patterns are established, defenses must address structure rather than sentiment. That is a much heavier burden. Pelosi's experience gave her tools to navigate structural critique, but those tools rely on shared assumptions about institutional good faith. When that good faith is questioned, even implicitly, responses begin to sound circular. Circularity breeds frustration, and frustration erodes deference. The audience reaction reflected this erosion, not through applause or protest, but through sustained attention. Sustained attention is the most dangerous reaction for power, because it signals unresolved concern. As the hearing moved forward, it became clear that the central issue was no longer about a single policy or decision. It was about whether the institution could convincingly demonstrate that its internal logic still aligned with public expectations of fairness. That alignment had not yet been restored. And until it was, every answer, no matter how polished, would feel provisional. This phase marked the point where damage, if it occurred, would not be immediate but cumulative. Cumulative damage is harder to reverse because it embeds itself into perception rather than record. Perception shapes elections, trust, and ultimately compliance. Once compliance becomes conditional, authority weakens regardless of legality. The hearing was quietly approaching that threshold. At this point, the political ecosystem outside the room began reacting faster than anyone inside anticipated, because the exchange had crossed from institutional procedure into narrative contagion. Clips were not circulating because of outrage, but because of coherence, which is far more dangerous in the age of fragmented attention. When a narrative feels internally consistent, people share it not to persuade others, but to confirm their own suspicions. This is how moments become reference points rather than news cycles. Once that happens, control shifts away from official channels permanently. Party leadership recognized the shift almost immediately, not through polling, but through message misalignment among their own surrogates. Talking points stopped landing in unison, press secretaries hedged, and background briefings grew vague. Vagueness is not a communication failure, but a defensive posture adopted when certainty risks contradiction. Contradiction invites scrutiny, and scrutiny was now unavoidable. The party's challenge was no longer to defend an individual, but to prevent the exchange from defining a broader pattern. This is where institutional loyalty begins to fracture along invisible lines. Those in safe districts prioritized ideological signaling, while those in competitive districts prioritized survivability. Survivability does not require agreement, only distance. Distance can be achieved through silence, delayed statements, or carefully neutral language that avoids endorsement without appearing hostile. This tactic was deployed unevenly, revealing internal stress. Meanwhile, donors began asking different questions, not about morality or optics, but about risk exposure. Risk exposure is the currency of political funding, and narratives that persist increase volatility. Volatility disrupts predictability, and predictability is what donors actually purchase. Once predictability erodes, funding recalibrates quietly but decisively. This recalibration rarely announces itself until long after outcomes are locked in. Media institutions adjusted as well, but more subtly, through framing rather than content. Panels replaced commentators, questions replaced conclusions, and emphasis shifted from judgment to interpretation. This move signals uncertainty about which narrative will ultimately survive. When media cannot determine the dominant frame, it creates space for audiences to do so themselves. Audience-driven framing is rarely favorable to incumbents. The most consequential shift, however, occurred within activist networks, where the exchange was interpreted through competing lenses of solidarity and accountability. Some viewed criticism as betrayal, others as overdue correction, and the lack of consensus weakened collective response. Movements rely on clarity of purpose to maintain momentum. When purpose fragments, energy dissipates. This dissipation does not eliminate influence, but it diffuses it. Diffused influence cannot exert pressure effectively. Inside the institution, procedural work resumed, but with altered subtext. Questions that once felt routine now carried latent implications. Even unrelated discussions were filtered through the memory of the exchange. This is how moments linger, not by repetition, but by reference. Every subsequent action is compared against the unresolved tension of the earlier confrontation. The individuals involved were now operating under asymmetric scrutiny. One faced intensified attention, while the other gained symbolic leverage without assuming additional responsibility. Symbolic leverage is powerful precisely because it does not require follow-through. It reshapes expectations while preserving deniability. That imbalance altered the strategic landscape moving forward. Attempts to reset the conversation failed because resets require mutual interest. There was no mutual interest anymore. One side needed closure, the other benefited from continuation. Continuation sustains relevance, while closure invites reassessment. Reassessment is dangerous when narratives remain unresolved. As days passed, the exchange became less about what was said and more about what could not be undone. Certain phrases, once spoken, resist reinterpretation. Efforts to contextualize them only amplify their circulation. The more they were explained, the more fixed they became. Language, once detached from intent, belongs entirely to the audience. This is the paradox of modern political speech. Precision intended to clarify can instead crystallize doubt. Ambiguity intended to soften can harden suspicion. Both outcomes undermine control. Control, once lost, cannot be reclaimed through repetition. The institution had entered a waiting phase, hoping attention would move elsewhere. But attention did not drift, because the exchange had tapped into a deeper unease about representation and accountability. Unease sustains focus far longer than outrage. Outrage burns quickly, but unease lingers. Lingering unease reshapes behavior incrementally. That incremental shift was now underway. What ultimately mattered was not the immediate fallout, but the way the exchange reconfigured how credibility itself was measured. For years, authority had been treated as cumulative, something built through repetition, seniority, and constant media presence. That assumption quietly collapsed the moment documentation overpowered declaration. Once that threshold is crossed, volume no longer substitutes for verification. The rules of persuasion change permanently. The public did not respond as a unified bloc, nor did it need to. Political change rarely requires consensus, only a sufficient erosion of trust among enough people to stall momentum. Skepticism does not need to win arguments. It only needs to interrupt belief. Once belief hesitates, obedience weakens. Weak obedience forces institutions into defensive maintenance mode. Defensive maintenance looks orderly on the surface, but it is strategically paralyzing. Energy shifts from expansion to containment, from agenda setting to damage control. Every move is evaluated for risk rather than opportunity. This is how power shrinks without formally being defeated. No resignation is required for influence to decline. The exchange also altered how silence was interpreted going forward. Previously, silence had been read as restraint or strategic patience. Now, silence carried the weight of evasion. In an environment saturated with records, absence of response invites reconstruction by outsiders. Outsider reconstruction is rarely charitable. Institutional actors understand this, which is why future hearings will be more rigid, more scripted, and less spontaneous. Spontaneity has become too dangerous when asymmetry of information exists. Those with access to primary materials can destabilize entire narratives with minimal theatrical effort. This realization will reshape preparation, staffing, and even committee choreography. The system adapts not to truth, but to exposure. What followed in private conversations was more revealing than any public statement. Colleagues stopped asking whether the confrontation was fair and began asking whether it was survivable. Survivability is the metric that governs long-term alignment. Once a figure is perceived as unshelterable, loyalty becomes optional. Optional loyalty evaporates quickly. This evaporation does not announce itself through dramatic breakaways. It appears instead as delayed endorsements, cautious language, and selective absence. Support becomes conditional, then intermittent, then symbolic. Symbolic support satisfies optics, but provides no insulation. Insulation is what matters when scrutiny persists. The deeper consequence was psychological, rather than procedural. Observers who had long suspected manipulation now felt validated, not persuaded. Validation hardens belief more effectively than argument ever could. When people feel validated, they stop listening to corrections. Corrections then sound like excuses. This dynamic ensures that attempts to rehabilitate reputation often accelerate decline. Every clarification reopens the wound. Every denial refreshes memory. The past becomes present again through repetition. Time, once an ally, becomes hostile terrain. The institution's final hope was fatigue, the assumption that attention would exhaust itself. But fatigue only works when narratives are shallow. This narrative had depth, documentation, and human consequence. Depth resists exhaustion. Human consequence anchors memory. What remains now is not a verdict, but a residue. Residue settles slowly and invisibly across future debates, future elections, and future trust calculations. It influences how words are weighed before they are spoken. It lingers when similar claims are made by different actors. It whispers, "We have heard this before." That whisper is more powerful than outrage, more durable than applause, and more corrosive than opposition. It does not demand justice or closure. It simply refuses to forget. And in politics, refusal to forget is often the beginning of the end.